I was just watching a video with Max Kellerman and Andre Berto, and they were having a discussion. There was other people on it. I don't remember the other guys' names. One guy was a football dude, and they were basically having a discussion about Canelo's legacy, and they were debating whether Canelo can do anything to hurt his legacy. And both sides were making valid points. And I was going to comment on the video, but I had too much to say and too much of a point that I wanted to make to just write out some long-ass comment that people probably aren't going to read. I thought it was an interesting topic overall. This isn't about specifically Canelo. It's just in general. Can a fighter tarnish his legacy? They were talking about Roy Jones and how, Roy Jones at his prime was basically untouchable, and once he came back down from heavyweight, he was never the same fighter. And I agree with that 100%. But the topic at hand was, can a fighter tarnish his legacy by staying around too long and getting beat up or knocked out by lesser opposition? And I feel like I have a quick and easy answer to this right away. And the answer is yes, he can. Because here's the thing. I'm gonna say two things that to try to make my point here. The question that you're asking is, can a fighter tarnish his legacy? He can. Of course he can. We're not saying, because if you look at it as like a graph, right? Or a line graph or a grid, right? And you look at how good a fighter is by what they're doing, by what they've proven, and you have a little bit of this, and all right, maybe he took a loss here or had a close fight to a guy he was supposed to kill, and it went like this, and then he jumps to heavyweight and wins a heavyweight title, and it goes. Again, I'm not speaking on anyone in specific. I'm trying to make a point that if you were to look at a line graph like that, does losing a fight at 50 years old and getting knocked out by a no-name ever lower that prime line? Never. If that prime point hits a higher point than anybody else's prime point ever hit, then you could sit there, and again, this is all subjective or whatever, but you could sit there and make the argument that nobody in their prime is beating Roy Jones, or nobody, I'm sorry, I said that wrong, that nobody is beating Roy Jones in his prime, or nobody's beating Mike Tyson in his prime, or whatever guy you want to name. I'm not trying to make any arguments for any specific fighters. No matter what, you could fight until, same thing with Tyson, with losing to Jake Paul, right? That tarnishes, and Mike Tyson was my favorite fighter of all time. That tarnishes Mike Tyson's legacy. But does it take away from how good and how destructive Mike Tyson was in his prime? Not at all, but that's not the question you're asking. You're asking, does it tarnish his legacy? The fact of the matter is that loss goes on his record. That knockout or that embarrassment or whatever it is goes on his record. And his legacy is his record is part of his legacy. It just is what it is. So if you go 50-0, right? Like take Mayweather, for example. If he goes 50-0 and beats 26 world champions and yada, 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 right? And you could turn around and you could easily say Mayweather at 35 years old, 40 years old was not the same fighter as he was when he called himself Pretty Boy. His hands were all fucked up. He was on his 5th weight class, yada, 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 right? Okay, I get that. He was still winning the fights though, right? So let's say Mayweather turns around now and comes back for whatever reason and has 10 more fights and gets knocked out in all 10 of those fights. It's going to tarnish his legacy, bro. That's a fact. That's not really a debatable thing. Now, I think the argument that people are trying to make is, oh, but Mayweather in his prime, 100, I'm not arguing with that. I'm not arguing with that. The guy was undefeated in his prime. The guy beat 26 world champions in his prime, won weight classes in 5 different weight divisions, won championships in 5 different weight divisions. I'm not debating any of that. But you're talking about someone's legacy. So I think when you talk about how good someone was in their prime, that could never be tarnished because that got to where it got to, and no matter where it goes after that, this is never going anywhere. But the legacy is their overall legacy. And if you start losing to people that are not good and they're knocking you out and it's embarrassing and whatever, it does tarnish your legacy. It just is what it is. And here's the second thing that I wanted to say to try to prove my point, okay? When you talk about, and I'm not trying to single out any specific person or argue for one side or the other or anything. I want you to understand the objective point that I'm trying to make. When you sit down and you have a debate with somebody, call it what you want. Call it an argument, call it a conversation, call it a debate. You guys could be agreeing with each other. I don't care. When you sit down and you have a conversation with somebody about someone's legacy, right? Let's take Bernard Hopkins, George Foreman, people like that, for example, right? Are we going to leave out the fact that George Foreman came back after whatever it was, a 10-year absence, and beat Michael Mora, who was, an animal at that time, and became the oldest heavyweight champion in boxing history? Is that just not going to be part of the conversation? Of course it is. Because the fact that somebody was able to accomplish such greatness at that age is part of their legacy, right? Roy Jones was not able to do that. And actually, Roy Jones and Bernard Hopkins even make a better example, and I'll give you why. We're talking about Roy Jones and how high he hit at his peak, and how maybe peak or prime Roy Jones can't ever be beat by anybody, okay? And again, I'm not saying I agree with that. Let's just keep that there, right? Bernard Hopkins was one of the people he beat. But then they fought again later in a boxing career, and Bernard Hopkins won. Does that make Bernard Hopkins a better fighter than Roy Jones? Not necessarily. Does it mean that Hopkins in his prime beats Roy Jones in his prime? Not necessarily. Does it mean Hopkins' prime hit a higher mark than Roy Jones' prime? Not necessarily. But it does mean that Hopkins aged better. It does mean that Hopkins was able to continue beating people after he was past his prime, or whatever way you want to look at it, whether you say he hit his prime in his 40s, whatever argument you want to make. The point that I'm trying to make by saying this is that when somebody becomes the oldest champion of all time, it's used for their legacy. So you can't tell me that, yeah, Roy Jones was getting knocked out by this guy and that guy, but he was 46 years old. Okay, and Bernard Hopkins was 48 years old when he won a title. So does that mean it doesn't mean anything? It doesn't. I watched Roy Jones' entire career. So for me, I know what Roy Jones was at his prime, and I know what Roy Jones was after he came back down from heavyweight, and he was never the same. And that's a fact. He wasn't the same. But what I'm trying to say to you is take somebody like Crawford, who, whatever his record is, 40-0, 41-0, whatever he is, and however old he is, 38 years old, walks away and retires right now from boxing undefeated, right? We don't know what would happen with Crawford if he fought up until 45 years old. Maybe he winds up with 52 wins and he passes Mayweather's record of 50-0. I'm not saying Mayweather has the best undefeated record ever, but it's like the most popular one, right? So by Crawford walking away, we can look at it and say, well, he avoided that Roy Jones scenario where he just kept fighting until he was 45, 46, 47 years old and getting knocked out and beat up by, no-name people or whatever. He avoided that by retiring from the sport as opposed to having the sport retire him. Maybe he walked away from being the next Bernard Hopkins, right? Maybe he would have never lost at 45 or 46 years old, and he would have still kept fucking everybody up, and that would have only made his legacy greater. So that's my point. You can't have somebody do something and say, well, if he keeps fighting and keeps winning, his legacy gets greater because of his age. But if he keeps fighting and keeps losing, it doesn't do anything to his legacy. It does. He's losing fucking fights. He went from, if Mayweather comes back and went from being 50-0 and fights 10 fights and gets knocked out 10 times by 10 nobodies, he's 50-10 now. That tarnishes his legacy, bro. Again, it doesn't take away from what he did, but overall it tarnishes his legacy. So I just wanted to hop on here and just touch on how being able to perform at that level, at that age, is part of your legacy. That is part of what made Bernard Hopkins such a great fighter. Was he a great... If Bernard Hopkins would have retired at 40 years old, would he have been a great fighter? Absolutely. He held that middleweight belt for whatever it was, a decade, made however many defenses of that middleweight belt. Bernard Hopkins is going to be a Hall of Famer whether he fights past 40 or not. But what I'm trying to say is that when you talk about how great Bernard Hopkins was, that's part of the reason he was so great. He was able to do something that most fighters are not able to do. So I feel like when you talk about someone's overall legacy, yes, every fight they have is going to affect their legacy in some way. It might not be extremely detrimental, losing 1 or 2 times at 45 years old, right? Take Crawford, for example. Let's say Crawford fights, another 3 fights, and he loses a fight. Let's say he comes back and he fights at 160 and he loses, right? Then he goes on and he fights another 7 fights up until 44 years old, and he fucking is killing everybody. He's looking like the same Bud Crawford as always. Yeah, he lost one. Yeah, that's not going to tarnish his legacy, bro. That's not going to be, oh, but he lost one, though. All right, I know, but, still the first male undisputed champion in 3 different weight classes, still jumped 2 weight classes and beat a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter relatively easily on the cards, right? Losing is not going to take away from your accomplishments or take away from where the peak of your career was, but it is going on your record, and it is going to matter in some way, shape, or form. Then let's say he fights until 48, 49 years old, and he loses again, and at that point we're like, all right, he doesn't look the same. He got knocked out. He got beat by a guy he shouldn't have got beat. No, that's not going to tarnish his legacy, but it's still on there. It's still on his record. He still lost. He was still the one that made that decision to keep fighting. And that's part of being, I don't want to say a great fighter, because, making good decisions is not necessarily a big part of being a great fighter. Being a great fighter is part of being a great fighter, but part of knowing when to walk away, knowing when you still have it, knowing when to take these risks. And you know what? I understand I'm 48 years old, but that's going to do nothing except make me the oldest champion in boxing history. This fucking guy ain't beating me. And then you go in the ring and do it. It's like he knew it. He believed in himself. He knew he was going to do that. This guy is insane. This guy is doing something nobody else has ever done before in boxing history. That makes his legacy better. On the flip side of that, if you make that decision like Roy Jones to keep fighting and keep getting knocked out by lesser people, I'm sorry, but it does tarnish your legacy. So I don't want to keep repeating the same things over and over again. I hope you guys got my point, but to me, there was kind of a clear answer to that, and I understand to a certain extent it is subjective and it is opinionated, but I also feel like to a certain extent it's not. I mean, you can't debate whether that's going on somebody's record or not. You can't debate whether... Like, my kids have never seen, maybe they've seen, like, older videos, right? Because I'm a giant boxing fan. But my kids didn't grow up watching Mayweather, right? They weren't 10 years old watching live Mayweather fights and seeing, oh, this guy's going to beat him, and then he wins. Oh, this guy's going to beat him, and then he wins. Oh, this guy punches hard, he's going to beat him, and then he wins. Sugar Shane Mosley rocking the shit out of him in the second round. Wow, he's going to go out, and then he wins the next 10 rounds in a row. They didn't witness that happening, right? So if Mayweather comes back right now, and I'm telling them, yo, this guy's one of the greatest boxers of all time, wait till you see this, and he comes back and he gets knocked the fuck out by a guy who is 25-7, they're going to be like, bro, what are you talking about? He's one of the greatest fighters ever. Oh, well, he's old now. Bro, it still happened. It's still in my kids' memory. That's what they saw. That's what they know of him, right? So it does. It goes on your record, and it does. I don't know if tarnish is the right word, because I don't know that we can say his legacy is tarnished in the sense that it's not amazing anymore. But it's blemished, let's put it that way, right? If you keep fighting into your 40s, maybe even close to 50 years old, and you losing to no-name fighters, these are blemishes on your legacy that are going on. That just is what it is. So I just wanted to stop in and drop my 2 cents on that. Peace.